Estamos en otra entrevista educativa, este espacio que hemos producido dentro del portal Educar Chile para discutir grandes temas de la educación. Hoy día tenemos la posibilidad de conversar con el profesor Christoher de la Universidad de Nottingham, que también hoy en día no solo es profesor en la Facultad de Educación de Nottingham, sino que adicionalmente está haciendo clases respecto de liderazgo en Sydney, Australia. De tal manera que tiene una experiencia internacional muy vasta, en especial en los temas de docencia, docentes y también líderes escolares. How are you, Christoher?
I'm well, thank you.
Maybe we can begin our dialogue in terms of this. One of your books, you talk about this idea of different phases of trajectory of the teachers. What is the main professional side of a teacher?
Well, what we found in this particular piece of research is a very large piece of national research with 300 teachers in 100 primary and secondary schools, was that teachers did not move from being a novice to becoming an expert as a result of experience. So that was an important finding for us, and so we were able to analyse the data in terms of different development phases, 6 development phases, within which teachers exhibited either a strong commitment trajectory, positive commitment trajectory, or a stable or even a diminishing commitment trajectory. And we found from that that commitment, both qualitatively and quantitatively in terms of our analysis of the data, commitment had an association with student attainment as well as teacher well-being and achievement.
They have some phases that are more risky in terms that, for example, to abandon the profession?
Yes, and you can see from the figures from many countries, not all, but many countries internationally, that the largest attrition rate or loss to teaching rate is among those who've been teaching between 0 and 4 or 5 years. That's where the largest, if you like, loss comes to the profession. We don't know if the loss is of effective teachers or less effective teachers, but we know we lose a lot of teachers there. However,
at the beginning of
the beginning of their career. However, I prefer, so of course policies are concerned with the retention of teachers because it's a loss of investment and our schools might suffer. However, there's less research, less policy attention given to the middle years, we call them the watershed years, and the later years of teaching. And it's not that necessarily teachers lose their energy, lose their passion for teaching during those middle and later years. They don't all. But what we find is that some do, and some do not. And so it's important, therefore, that we take note of what happens in those middle years of teaching and why it happens, and the same with the later years of teaching. For example, in the watershed years, this is the middle years of teaching, what we find is that teachers who have worked hard up until that point all of their career, maybe sacrificed their personal lives, their social lives to some extent, are now beginning to question this. And so they're making decisions as to what energy they're going to give to their passion for teaching, if you like, and whether or not they're now going to restrict some of that energy because they want to develop a personal life. Maybe they have parents who have more need for them, children who have more need for them, partners who have more need for them.
And in the later time, this is a thing that is interesting. You think that they have a problem of age too? Because they have a discussion in some case in Chile about that. You say, well, it's not good that a teacher that I don't know has an age of 60, as working with little kids. Do you think that this is a restriction or not necessarily?
We did not find that that was a restriction for all teachers in that age range, in that later career phase, if you like. On the contrary, we found that whilst some teachers had become disenchanted and worn down, we know that teaching itself is inherently a stressful profession, others found their delight, if you like, their sense of achievement in the relationships that they were able to continue to have with the children or young people whom they taught. They were not concerned with career development by then. So they stayed in teaching because they loved the job. So there were both of these groups in the later years. Of course, physically, some will be slower than others, but they had learned to manage this in the way in which they taught in the classroom.
Now we have a new teacher's career in which we have mentors for new teachers, and that is new in Chile. And in Latin America we don't have a lot of this kind of experience. You think that this idea to be mentor is maybe interesting for some teachers to not continue in the classroom necessarily all the time, but to have this possibility to learn and work with novice teachers?
I think it's a very important notion that teachers in their early years should be positively supported and challenged in their work. After all, they're learning the job. Teaching, you know, is one of the only professions when, as soon as you're qualified, you have exactly the same responsibilities as people who've been teaching 10 years or 15 years or 25 years. It's an odd, if you like, unusual event. However, during those early years, it's not simply having a mentor. And remember, there's a difference between mentor and coach. So it's not simply having a mentor, but it's having the right mentor. It's also having a mentor who is able to have the interpersonal as well as the technical skills, as well as the commitment to help young teachers develop. It cannot be someone who is put into the classroom with the sole purpose, for example, of monitoring their work or assessing their work. These are different functions. So I think if the criteria for selection of mentors are correct, then both the mentor and the young teacher will gain a great deal of satisfaction and achievement from that relationship.
You think that the mentor doesn't have this assessment task? The mentorship must be more dedicated and focused in the development and a sort of trust relationship?
Of course, the mentor will inevitably, because of the mentor's experience, be assessing in a formative way the development of that teacher. But if that assessment is used as a means of reporting back to the school, then no, I don't think they should be involved, because that's in relation to particular career steps or maybe even financial reward. And I think that would, well, the evidence points to the fact that would change the nature of the relationship between mentor and young teacher.
What elements of the context you think that is important to don't have this kind of stress or burnout of teachers? For example, we have a lot of discussion here about the number of students in the classroom, or the poverty and of the families, and the cultural situation of the communities. What elements do you think are more important in this domain of the context that are more adverse for teaching and that produce more stress or more?
Do you mean in terms of mentoring or?
No, in general. In terms of the context that are in the schools and in terms of comparative.
Yes.
Context.
There is no doubt in my mind, and again the research points to the fact that although teaching, if you're to teach well and to your best, all teaching is inevitably stressful. We have to remember that children and young people are in the classroom by law, not by choice. Yeah? So we're not dealing necessarily with people who love learning. Some in the class will love learning, others will not. So of course it's stressful. But the additional stress caused by children or young people from disadvantaged communities means that not only do teachers have to be intellectually vigilant and intellectually active in the classroom all the time, that's stress enough you would think, but also they have to have huge amounts of emotional understanding and also emotional resilience, the capacity to be resilient, because these children are more likely than others to bring with them part of the history of the families perhaps, that they're from, and perhaps an alienation from education. We always have to remember that children in school go back to their homes, go back to their peer groups every single day. And their homes and their peer groups have an immense influence, positively and negatively, upon them. So teachers who teach in schools in highly disadvantaged circumstances are likely, we can say are likely, to need to have far greater capacity for resilience, far greater store of emotional resources. I think, and we know, professional empathy might be one of them, for example.
One particular difficulty is the different multicultural classrooms. Now more and more we have this situation, and how do you think that the can manage this situation, the teachers, because in some occasions they have in the classroom some students that they don't know the language, the native language of these students.
It's not easy for any teacher. The key to this is the school policy, in my view. The school policy must be one of inclusivity. Now, inclusivity demands differentiated teaching, demands that teachers take account of individual needs. Some of those needs will be behavioural, emotional, some of them will be to do with the language, and so on. You cannot, of course, expect teachers to be able to speak and understand a variety of different languages. They're not trained to do that, nor should they be. So, nevertheless, if the school, under the leadership of a principal, which incidentally is also a policy of most governments, if a school has a commitment to equity, we call it sometimes social justice, we call it sometimes inclusivity, then there needs to be a school policy for this, which reaches into the classroom. That policy, of course, needs to be supported through resources and different kinds of resources. Some might be support for teachers in terms of training, others might be a variety of resources in the classroom. Certainly we know that from research that successful and effective principals are those who also involve the community in the dialogue, particularly in multicultural schools with all the challenges of teaching in that, in those schools. My own belief is that there should be at least one teacher in the school who is skilled and trained in multiculturalism, if you want to call it that, and so can lead the other teachers in that respect. That teacher will be a classroom teacher, but will be a leader in respect of.
And you think in the same line, you think that it's important this presence and activity of other professionals, psychologists or social workers inside the school?
Yes, I do. One of the issues in many countries is that psychologists and social workers are regarded as separate from the school life. So they may come in when asked or when directed to come in for brief meetings really, with either students or parents or a combination or with teachers, but then they go. And so if you look at the Netherlands, for example, or if you look at parts of America, you can see that they have an integrated program of education in which psychologists and social workers have a presence in a group of schools on a regular basis rather than when extreme circumstances require it.
That's good. You create some concepts as professional empathy, for example.
Yes.
That you use the word resilience.
Yes.
How you can explain a little about this?
About both of those terms?
Yes, especially professional empathy, I think that is important, but the other two.
Well, what again we know from research is that successful teachers are those who not only are able to transmit knowledge and cognitive, if you like, knowledge and information, but children and young people tell us that successful teachers are those who exercise what we might call authentic care. They care for the whole student, and to care for someone you need to know them. And so to know them part of your knowing is understanding where they're coming from, understanding their circumstance. And as we know, we call that empathy. We can put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, the shoes of the student, for example, just as the principal in the school must exercise care with his or her teachers in doing that. However, the function of teachers, the purpose of education, whether you're a teacher or a school principal, is to influence the students for the best. So you're concerned with their academic development, you're concerned with their personal and social development and their well-being. And so it is not enough simply to understand where the student is coming from, or in the case of the principal, where the teacher is coming from. You must also have your professional task in mind. So understanding and acting upon that understanding is my view of what professional empathy is. You're acting upon an understanding in the interests of continuing to provide the best possible education for the children and young people in the school. So that's how I would describe professional empathy, to distinguish it from empathy, the more general term. In terms of resilience, as you I'm sure know, for many, many years, resilience has been regarded as a trait, something you're born with or something you develop in the early years. It's been defined often as the ability to bounce back in extremely adverse circumstances. It's often associated with physical trauma or emotional or mental trauma. Now, what we find from more recent research is that resilience is not only a trait, it's also a capacity. In other words, it can fluctuate. So you can be more resilient or less resilient in certain conditions at certain times, and we don't have time now to go into the detail of that. But if you think of the job of a teacher, which is what we're thinking of now, I think, by definition, a teacher in a classroom is dealing with both the academic and the emotional. And so you would say that every day, it's a term I coined, everyday resilience is required of every teacher who is willing to and able to teach well and to their best on an everyday capacity. If you talk about differentiating between students' needs, then you have to give out, expend a lot of emotional energy as well as a lot of intellectual energy. And to do that 5 days a week, 46 weeks a year, or however long the week or the year is, you can see is something which is very tiring. So it's the job of a teacher to be resilient with the students. Some of the words we associate with resilience are hope, academic optimism, and so on. It's certainly the job of the principal of the school to build rather than destroy teachers' capacity to be resilient, both through the development of the particular culture of the school. You might say it's also a responsibility of government to ensure that the principals and the technical people in the school, or the principal's opposite number, who is responsible for pedagogy, it's particularly important for the government to make sure that those people as leaders are healthy, both in the intellectual and emotional sense, and therefore that they also have a capacity for resilience in what, after all, are very challenging times and challenging circumstances for all schools.
You think that in a school they can have this kind of support, you can develop resilience of the teachers? You say by one side, by the leadership of the principal and so on, but maybe also for the communities of teachers, no?
Yes, absolutely. And so we talk about individual, relational and organizational resilience, if you like, those three different levels. And yes, it is possible, but it's not. Having said that, I must emphasize that this is not simply a technical exercise. It's not an exercise of designing a program, designing a course, giving the course, and then leaving or forgetting. Resilience is a dynamic construct. It's like teacher identity. It's a dynamic construct which can fluctuate, can change according to circumstance. And so the principal of the school has to be alert to this, has to be alert to the changes. Almost, you might say, has to be able, through his or her intelligence gathering, to almost predict the changes before they happen, so that, whether they're external or internal, so that we don't end up with teachers who are struggling to teach well and to their best. But we give them the support, the professional empathy, but also the practical support before that even happens. This demands, for example, a principal who is not in their office all the time, who is present, who does have a knowledge of his or her teaching staff and the community.
You think that for this, we have this dialogue about the difficulty to be teachers and the capacity that they need to mobilize to do their job. What do you think about their initial training for that? It must be more in the schools, less in the university. You must combine these two institutions. What is you need to change the average maybe? Less time in the university, more time in the schools? Or it depends on the type of presence or activities?
Well, you know, if you look at research on initial teacher education and training, you can see that much, not all, but much of it, particularly where it involves reporting back by the students who have experienced the training in the university, for example, what you find is they're quite critical of it. They say even now, despite the increase in the amount of time spent in practicum and so on, even now they say, well, the university is the theory and I'm not always able to apply the theory into practice. If you go into schools, as young pre-service teachers do, you often find that teachers in the schools say, well, you can forget the theory now, this is the reality, this is the practice. And so there is an argument for placing more emphasis in the training in the schools themselves. In some countries, this is more so we talk about in England, for example, preponderance of school-based pre-service teacher training, where universities stop becoming the dominant partner but become the supportive partner, and schools themselves become the dominant partner. Now, there are dangers in this, because again we know from other research that teachers are in general conservative, that schools in general are conservative places. And so we have to put a question mark against the move towards too much emphasis on schools leading pre-service teacher training, and maybe try to balance the two in some way.
Oh, thank you, Professor Day, for all this possibility to dialogue about the situation of teachers and their preparation and also their main job. Maybe the last question, as we have talked and asked this question for all our different people that we invite to this interview, is if you need to give us, the Chileans, one advice about our education, what will be your advice to improve our education?
Well, the one piece of advice that I would give to anyone, keeping in mind that all countries are interested in making sure that all students achieve to their best, in different ways, but to their best. The one piece of advice I would give is make sure, first of all, that all those who come into the profession, into pre-service training and into schools themselves, not only have knowledge about their subject and about children and young people, but are passionate about their work. And then, as part of that advice, make sure that principals in schools are also passionate about their work through teachers in improving and continuing to improve the opportunities for academic achievement and well-being among their children and young people. So those are the two, I suppose, pieces of advice I would give. But in relation to teachers in particular, the aim of every government, I believe, the aim of every principal, I believe, the aim of every academic in education departments, I believe, should be to ensure that the best opportunities are provided to teachers, not only to teach to their best, which many teachers do, sometimes despite the circumstances and challenges, but that they also are able to teach well. So teaching to your best, having resilience, having commitment is not enough unless those things ensure that you teach well.
Thank you, Professor Day. Y a ustedes los dejamos invitados para que no solo puedan seguir viendo esta entrevista, sino muchas otras que tenemos en el portal Educar Chile.